there's this idea of them treating humanity as like something almost like lower. I think, for example, here it says, I observed most of the members I observed were unclear about their relationships, were becoming too human. So they use too human as like a dismissive kind of sense.
Yep.
But then I'm also thinking it's interesting that they're doing it in this way because as we looked with Vico and Rappaport and like generally how people view the origin of the term human, it was a way to distinguish people that were within civilization from people that were kind of in the more natural state, right?
Yeah,
So,
that's a good point. It's
so then
almost the
now,
opposite with them.
so now they're like trying to revert that in a weird way. Now humans are the things that are like barbarian and separate and other, and like we're the higher form that's looking down on them. So that's just was interesting to me. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the members themselves were were encased in human vessels. So they were trying to overcome being human. I
Right.
don't know that they looked down on people. They might have, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Um,
maybe that's me characterizing it a certain way.
but they definitely no, I think you're making a really cool observation though that they are kind of inverting that the designator human is not one with positive connotations. It's almost exclusively negative for them. And there's this higher race that they're sort of aspiring to become more like, that is sort of the creators of humans. Like
But
they talk about like the relationship between the next level and the human race, kind of in the same way that like they used a lot of agricultural metaphors. Like they talked about humans being plants and the next level are gardeners, or we're like livestock and they're like farmers. You know what I mean?
yeah, no, it's just interesting to me because I feel like that's exactly how the term human even originated. It was the designator of being the higher race over these like peasants, basically.
Well, and this is one of the elements of like a totalizing belief system. And like one of the aspects of it is this very sharp dichotomy between, the good and saved people and the bad damned people. You know what I mean? But then this question arises of like, okay, well then is Christianity a totalizing belief system?
Oh, I think almost all of the Christianity versions are totalizing, I guess, by your definition.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you got two categories. Yeah, unless you're doing like, what Origin was trying to do with reincarnation, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Because I mean, even the Catholic Church, they have I forget the exact term, but like they basically think that there's a synthesis of works and grace, but grace is still like the main driver. Like grace is always like this main factor. And that excludes a lot of people from ever even attaining salvation.
Well, and this is something that I would say recently has become sort of a fixation for me with Heaven's Gate is, where does their concept of grace come in, and
Mm,
free will and all that. And I think I've talked to you about this a little bit. But basically, so the way that salvation works with Heaven's Gate is, on the surface, it seems like it's mostly focused on you perform these practices, you overcome your humanness. But there's there's a little bit more to it than that. You first have to be selected by the next level to even want to go through these practices, to even want to overcome your humanness. Because like just like in like Christianity, we can't choose God because we don't want God. Like we're in a fallen state, so like, and part of being in that fallen state is we don't want something more than this state, right? So how do you solve that? Well, God has to intercede. He has to select you. He has to give you uh, a desire to seek him. And
mm,
that's kind of what you get with Heaven's Gate, where they, from what I understand, I don't think they actually believe that every human being who's alive has a soul, which is very unusual. Like we were
But
familiar with the concept of like some souls are saved and some aren't, but they kind of, I don't know, they almost make it more efficient, I guess, in a way. They kind of cut out the middleman there and say, well, no, some people don't have souls to begin with, you know? But once you're given that soul, once you're given that deposit of information about this higher realm or a desire to seek it out, the responsibility is on you to like nurture that. So definitely, like being raised Catholic, I see a lot of similarities between Heaven's Gate's understanding of grace and salvation and all that, and kind of what you're talking about, where it's this synthesis of works and grace. But ultimately, grace is the first mover. It really doesn't make sense to have it any other way. Could like I do you
Mhm.
kind of get where I'm going with that?
yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, most of the belief systems that focused on works kind of died out, like Origin and who's the Pelagius, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's just something about it that appeals to these kind of organizations. Maybe it like reifies your position in it and your leadership and your choices in some way. I
Yeah, I
guess
mean, or it could be what they were exposed to. Like, I don't know what Nettles' relationship to Christianity was, but I know Applewhite he was the son of a Presbyterian minister. I don't know very much about Presbyterianism, um,
I know a
but I would
bit
imagine
of
that probably had some influence on him.
it's I'm pretty sure it's like an evangelical religion. And the Presbyterian is mostly like a kind of social organization. I don't know if they're known to be like particularly radical though.
Maybe it influenced him insofar as he thought this isn't radical enough, you know?
True, yeah. And we saw that with Monty.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
good point.
Um,
Well, that's the other thing too. The Monarchian Heaven's Gate connection is also like that they're ultimately a materialist religion. Like you were talking earlier about how there's quotes from Applewhite and Nettles where they say we're literally talking about going to a physical place. This isn't a metaphor. Like I think that's one of the most interesting things about it is that they have all this like spiritual and almost idealist language, but when
uh,
you actually break down their belief system and you know look at it kind of as it is, they're materialists at the end of the day. Like their afterlife is not in some transcendent non-physical realm. It's literally located in the universe. Like we just can't get there because it's so far away, you know? Like that's very different from Christianity where it's like, well, it's not like you can't get to heaven because you don't have a spaceship to get there. Like that's not why, it's because it's in another realm. But that's not really the case with Heaven's Gate. Like everything is in the same, like they're monistic, metaphysically.
yeah, like yeah, yeah.
You
I'm
have this
wondering,
like dualism in the like moral sense, which is I think where like the Manichaean stuff definitely comes in, but then there's also they're like monistic metaphysically. It's like
they're
I know
also
it's
both
weird.
they're both materialists though, so that brings in some similarities,
Hmm.
right? Because I don't think the Heaven's Gate doesn't think the soul is necessarily the spiritual substance, do they? They think everything's like
No,
in the world.
no, it's like it's made of the same. Yeah, it's a material thing. The analogy that I like to use, it's not one that I'm aware of that they used. It's one I kind of came up with. It's kind of like when your soul transfers from a human body to the next level, or when your soul leaves the human level and goes to the next level, it's kind of like taking it's like taking the files off of like an old computer and putting it into like a newer, better one, rather than you're switching from one mode of reality to another. You know what I mean?
Right. But yeah, I want you to go into the kind of last one, maybe the last stage of Heaven's Gate after Nettles dies and the suicide part.
Okay. Um, so the thing about Nettle's death and characterizing it as like Heaven's Gate before and after her death isn't something that I personally like. That's not like that's not something that I do, I guess.
Yeah.
Like I know that's kind of common, um, but I don't look at it that way, like because well, there's a lot of reasons. But main one being I don't think that Nettle's death had the kind of impact on their belief system that some scholars seem to think it did. I'm not saying it didn't have any impact on it at all, but the thing is, Heaven's Gate's belief system was always evolving and always developing. And to suggest that this particular event had more of an impact than any other event, to me, is that's a bit of a reach. And I think there's reasons why that narrative has kind of persisted. Um, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of the materials the group left behind um, have not been accessible to a lot of people. Um, but I don't know how much I want to get into that specifically. But
Okay.
um,
I don't I don't want to say to characterize it that way either. I kind of was just going with the main narrative.
no, yeah, no, you're good. The way the way I would describe it is that a few there are a few iterations of their end times prophecy, is the way I would put it. So in the very beginning, like the very earliest days of the group that we now know as Heaven's Gate, they predicted what they called the demonstration. The demonstration was like the earliest um, end times prophecy that they espoused. Basically, the demonstration was this idea that Applewhite and Nettles would preach their message about being from the next level and the world is about to end and all that jazz. They would do that for a few years, and then the government or the media or some other authority figure would uh, put a stop to that by executing them. And they would execute them in public and they would display their bodies in the streets for 3 days. And then after that 3 day period, they would rise from the dead, thereby demonstrating that they had mastered life and death, that they were who they said they were, that they came from heaven and all that. And then they would ascend to heaven in their earthly bodies, the same way that like um Enoch and Elijah in the Bible are believed to have ascended to heaven in their bodies. Um, and whoever had believed in them during the period where they were preaching, they would also leave with them. But this prophecy had a time limit on it, right? So they predicted they would be doing this for a certain number of days, like 1200 something days, which they took from the book of Revelation. Once that time period was up, well, they had a problem, right? Where it's kind of like, well, we're still here and no one has tried to stop us. No one has executed us. So they sort of, I'm going to say certain things that are going to differ from the way that Heaven's Gate believers themselves would put it. And I want to point that out. Like I might say, like, they shifted their message, but the actual people that believe this stuff, they wouldn't put it that way. They would say they received new information. Does that make sense so far?
Yes.
So like they would say like, we thought we were supposed to demonstrate our power over life and death by doing this demonstration, but then we got new information from the next level that says actually that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to do something else. You know, and this happened several times. Like in the 80s, they started focusing more on UFO extraction, like a UFO would come down and pick them up. In the 90s, they started revisiting this idea of, maybe some authority figure will come and take us out. And this was especially um realistic, I guess, for them, because in the early 90s you had stuff like the Waco siege, you had the Ruby Ridge siege. So you had these events almost back to back. I think Ruby Ridge was 1992 and Waco was 1993. So you had these major events where the government went into some sort of commune like group, um, and took them out. Um, so at one point, actually, in the 90s, Heaven's Gate considered instigating a shootout between themselves and the police. They thought maybe that would be a good way to go, because like the goal was they had to get off the planet, right? So they considered like, maybe if we stock up some guns, we'll make people paranoid, and the government will have to come and intervene, and they'll do what they did at Waco and Ruby Ridge and all that stuff. But they ended up not doing that because they started to think about it like, well, what if we don't all get killed? We all want to leave at the same time. What if some of us end up getting like paralyzed or permanently disabled or something? So they set that idea aside, and they then, after all these iterations, and I'm leaving out a bunch of other ones too, after all these other iterations, um they kind of came to the conclusion that they might have to bring about their own deaths themselves. So when I say it like that, like, I guess the point I'm trying to draw is that, like, the sort of the narrative around Nettles' death is that prior to her death, there was no talk of suicide. There was no talk of literally leaving this earth in some kind of violent end. But that's just not true. Like, going all the way back to the very first days of their mission on Earth, the death of the leaders was always part of it. The death of the followers later became part of it. Like, eventual death, of the human body was kind of always a basic ingredient of this recipe. Like, this wasn't something that only came about after Nettles died. That is, I think, that's sort of like a hill that I'm willing to die on, if I had to pick one. And it's because I think it's a big gap in the discourse around this group, is this idea that this event had a certain impact on the group. I've listened to recordings that the group made immediately after Nettles' death, and the attitude that they had towards her death was, first of all, that she didn't really die. She didn't die. She re-entered the next level. She was extracted from her body, and all is well. Like, actually, like in the Netflix documentary, they talk about how the group was like in a state of complete depression for days, and like Applewhite like locked himself in his room for like a week or something, and just was like so like despondent. But the tapes that I've listened to, like, that were recorded immediately after her death, I'm talking like a day or two after she died, they're laughing, they're joking, they're talking very optimistically about the future. They're characterizing this event in a positive way, about as positive as it could be.
Well, I was
And
wondering because the HBO does the same thing, and then both of it's kind of like they're like this brought doubt into the system, and I kind of was skeptical of that claim too because it doesn't. You're already believing that your soul goes up to the next level, and why is it such a leap to not bring a death, like a death being added to this process? Doesn't, like, no one thought that these people were immortal, did they?
no, I mean to I think that I think that when people say those things, they're making an educated guess. Because most of the scholarship around Heaven's Gate, um, almost all of it, in fact, relies on materials that pretty much anyone can access. They rely on videos that you can find on YouTube, like the Beyond Human VHSs. They rely on the videos of the group right before they died, the exit statements and Doe's final exit. Um, and they rely on the website, which anyone can go on and read. You can read the Heaven's Gate basic text whenever you want.
Hmm.
Um, that's where most of the scholarship comes from. And the problem is that this group, they recorded like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of audio tapes of their meetings and their classes and their their lectures and stuff. Um, and that's something that is sort of, I mean, it's sort of on like the down low kind of thing. Like there's issues with why those aren't as easily accessible, and I want to be careful about what I say about that, because there's a lawsuit going on involving those tapes.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that Heaven's Gate scholarship has suffered from a lack of access to all of these materials. I think that there are a lot of gaps that are in the story because we haven't because people haven't had access to all these materials, you know.
It's not
Um
just that though. They also, it seems like they want to put it in this cult specific cult narrative.
I think there are some, like, again, I don't want to go to one extreme or the other. I think there are some people that sort of have that as like a preconception, like this is a cult, this is a dangerous group. We need to make sure that no one ever joins a group like this again. But to me, that is not scholarship. I'm not saying that it's wrong to do that. I'm just saying you're not doing scholarship at that point.
Well,
You're on a mission, you have an agenda.
I'm thinking about the Netflix series specifically. Like, I'm not making claims about anyone in particular, but this Netflix thing, what it was kind of like, this is how cults are formed, and then they put Heaven's Gate as like a specific instance of it.
Yeah, you're talking about how to be a cult leader.
Yeah, and so then I'm kind of thinking you're kind of like going backwards from your conclusion,
Oh
which
yeah.
is to say that they're not a cult or dangerous in any way, but if you're looking for it to be in the specific steps of a cult, then of course you're gonna look at this event from that light, right?
That's exactly the thing. Like I
Yeah.
I remember I remember the first time that I ever encountered the word cult, which is very rare. Like, I mean, how often do you remember the exact moment you learned a word, you know? I remember it. I was in seventh grade and I was in my middle school library and I found this little green book, um that was called, it might have just been called Cults or something, or no, it was called Charismatic Cult Leaders was the name of the book. And that was the first time I encountered the word cult. And what I learned a cult was a cult is a group that's in this book. You know what I mean? Like that's how the word operated for me. It was, if a group is in this book, it's a cult because that's the title of the book. I mean, it was in seventh grade. I didn't think much more about it. Um, this was before I got into like philosophy and got into Socrates and like the search for definitions and all that. But I think that's kind of a lot of what goes on is like, I don't know. It's very complicated. Like, I think that I think that people a lot of times when they're using the word cults, especially to describe groups that they themselves have been part of, like I don't really have a problem with that. Like I don't really have a problem with somebody um claiming that they were in a cult, I guess. If that is a way of, I don't know, cuz like clearly there are groups that take advantage of people and do terrible shit to people and disempower people, and maybe using that word to sort of label these groups after you get out is a way of sort of taking back some of that power for yourself. I don't know that I would ever want to remove that from people. You know what I mean? But it's like when we're trying to, if our goal is to understand how a belief system works and potentially why, um like if our goal is to understand how a belief system works, I don't understand what this label actually does for us, you know. I mean, Zeller has made kind of similar points in a much more coherent way than I am here, but
Um, yeah, I mean, at least you're not using Chat GPT to say it. But
yeah, well, it's showing me, it's showing me the blank spots in my own thinking about this. It's showing me the things that I need to spend more time thinking about because I'm having trouble putting it into words.
that's why we do this show, right?
It's a big part of it, man. Like I've loved doing these so much that like you know, even after we did the Rappaport talk, I remember when I was editing it, I was at work and I stepped outside for a minute and you were talking about um rituals, and I was looking around at all the Christmas lights in the neighborhood that I work in, and I was like, fuck, this is a ritual. Everything is a ritual. I had this like Fourth and Walnut experience, you know, like Thomas Merton, where everything just sort of connected, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to read the rest of that book too, because I think no one talks about him. We're one of the only videos on YouTube about him.
Really? That's
Yeah.
pretty um that's pretty cool.
So I was trying to see like other resources and like it's just us. But so I want to go just real quick. So we talked about the suicide and both of us kind of used the word contingent to describe it. At least that's how it seemed.
Yeah.
Um, because I was just wondering, and maybe you can elucidate this, like how much was this part of their philosophy to begin with? Like we also talked about how Schopenhauer, like some people claim he praises suicide, but then it's like it's kind of contingent for him too, in the same way.
Well, I would say that even the meaning of the word suicide is contingent in
Yeah.
Heaven's Gate's perspective. On their website, for example, they have a text that they wrote, I think in late 1996. It's called Our Position Against Suicide. Um, but the title is a little bit misleading, um, in my opinion, because their their position against suicide is really formed by simply redefining suicide. For them, suicide is defined as turning away from the next level. So for them, ending their human lives to leave the planet Earth and enter the next level was not suicide. Rather, staying behind on planet Earth and forsaking this opportunity to escape, that would have been suicide.
Hmm.
As far as the actual event itself being contingent, um, this is one of the things that I think confuses people a lot is when they find out um, that there are still people who are alive today who were once members of this group, um, who still continue to espouse belief in Applewhite and Nettles' teachings. And most people, when they think of Heaven's Gate, they think, well, this was a suicide cult, right? They all ended their lives. How can there still be people that follow their teachings? And that's where the contingency aspect becomes really important because, from their perspective, this opportunity to leave the planet was a very narrow window, and that window is now closed. Like the way that I put it, I don't know that they necessarily put it in these terms, but the way that I kind of have explained it to people when they ask me about it is, think about it. Like the spaceship came and collected these people and then it flew off. So, from their point of view, bringing an end to their own lives at this stage in history would be pointless because the spaceship is gone. The opportunity to leave has passed. And the way that Heaven's Gate works is that every couple thousand years or so, another opportunity to get off of the planet will be made available. But until then, people are just going to like reincarnate over and over again. So there's still an incentive to follow the practices and work on overcoming their humanness, because in the next life, the work that they put into overcoming their humanness now will carry over into the next life and the next life and so on. So there's still an incentive to follow those practices. Um, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally.
It's kind of like I mean, maybe this is a bad analogy, but it's kind of like you're at the airport and your flight has a set time that it's going to take off. And if um you don't get there in time, the plane's not going to wait for you, right?
Right. What would be like the main takeaway from this Heaven's Gate discussion, and why you think it's important in the context of like why would be a good thing to look into for anyone?
Well, I think that today we're, as a culture, I think we are doing a lot of really good and interesting work in trying to like in today's culture, there is definitely much more of an emphasis on trying to set aside one's own personal preconceived ideas about what other people think and how other people experience the world. And this idea that different people might see things differently than you. And I think that's a good thing. I just find it a little weird that that doesn't seem to be applied equally. And I think Heaven's Gate is a good challenge to that idea. I think that Heaven's Gate is an example of one of those groups that doesn't get that treatment. We don't treat them the same way that we would treat any other religious group. We don't treat them the same way that we would treat any other kind of group identity, like where we sort of have this attitude that because what they did was so extreme and it was so deadly, um, we have sort of a right to set aside their perspectives on their own beliefs, and we get to sort of decide this. No, this is why you believe these things. You believe these things because you were brainwashed. You're crazy.
Mhm.
You're missing something in your life, whatever. But I don't. We don't really. I mean, I don't know. I don't see that attitude in the way that people, at least like in academia, like the way that people treat other religions. Like you would never get away with something like that, you know. Um so I think it's hard for people to understand, like we're in such an increasingly secular society, where the kind of commitments that was required of someone to follow Heaven's Gate, like you're giving up sex, you're giving up a normal life, you're giving up any kind of worldly sensuous pleasure, like the kind of commitments that was required is so foreign to most of us that I think it's hard for people to actually believe that these people genuinely thought that these ideas were correct. I think it's hard for people to imagine that there isn't something else at play in why people joined this group. But I think I'm of the opinion that the only thing we have to go on is what they said. And what they said is that they believed this stuff. I mean, we don't have to agree with them, but I think if we want to be respectful to them, um, a good place to start is with assuming that they believed what they said they believed and that their actions can be explained in terms of that belief. It's
Yeah.
kind of my thoughts on it.
No, I think I agree overall. I mean, there's some, like we distinguished, there is some reason to connect or disconnect the like why did they join from why did they stay. and maybe there could be more coercion in the latter than the former. But overall, I think I agree with you. And I also think lots of religions have coercion too, but they don't get the same treatment in a sense. They don't all end with a group suicide though, so I do think that colors it too. But I mean,
That is
Christianity,
true.
Christianity and Islam in particular, since those are the big ones in kind of the West, I think they do lead people to decisions that we would find problematic, but we see the same treatment of Islam too, right? Like
Uh-huh.
it doesn't get held to the same standards as Christianity. Like a crazy Christian group is called a cult and not connected to Christianity at all. But a crazy Islamic group would be like, oh, this is jihad. It's in the Quran. This is all this is all of what Islam is.
Yeah.
But you don't see that with like a offshoot like Heaven's Gate, for instance.
Yeah, ironically, there's a very totalizing way that people characterize religions, you know.
Yeah. So I find that interesting too, but I don't want to get too off topic right at the end.
Right. No, and I mean my whole thing is like my whole thing is that I just want to have as many conversations about this group as people want. Like I'm not trying to like I'm never the one going in and saying, hey, you need to stop using the word cults. Like it's not I'm not ever going to really be doing that. But I've
Yeah.
had plenty of people telling me that like I've had people talk to me and say, you know, this is great, but you don't focus enough on how crazy they are. You don't focus enough on how dangerous they are. And it's like that might be true. That might be a fair assessment. I think I can live with that.
Hmm.
But because everyone else is already having that conversation, I just want to have a different one. Everyone else can have their own conversations, but I'm just like, can we have a different one sometimes? You know what I mean? Like it's not like a replacement. It's more of like, you know, is this the only way we can talk about this group? You know, is this the only discourse that is on offer? You know?
Yeah, and I would put one last disclaimer is I think both me and you in general think most uh most of these kind of groups are dangerous and like they get categorized as cults are dangerous in some ways. We just don't focus on every single way that people want us to, and that can get dicey, especially online.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
Right?
maybe we'll have to do a deep dive on online cults one of these days. Or
Because I'm
maybe
just
the internet is a cult.
because I think the way that Heaven's Gate was dangerous is kind of more subtle than like how Synanon is dangerous. Like we talked about that briefly. Or like
Yeah. I
or
was
like
thinking about that today. I was thinking about that today because Synanon makes me angry. And I
mm,
think it makes me angry in a way that other groups like that don't. And I think that there's probably some bias I have because I'm someone that's been through like addiction recovery groups and stuff. So I have like a personal connection to that. And that's why reading about Synanon, I think makes me a lot angrier than when I read about like Heaven's Gate or something. And I'm like, oh, this is really cool. It's really clever what they did here, how they created this whole belief system kind of from scratch almost. And it's really robust and interesting. But then when I start looking at guys like Chuck Dieterich and Synanon, I'm like, ah, these guys, I hate them. Like, I hate that. And I
right.
don't know, maybe that's a bias that I need to watch out for.
Well, I'm wondering too, my last thought is the what seems to me what happened with Heaven's Gate is like you had too many like-minded people encouraging each other towards this common doom.
Mm,
Whereas and I just don't get the vibe from Applewhite that he was kind of like trying to do use this group to his own advantage. Like he was a believer too. And that
Yeah.
is that's dangerous that you have all these people reinforcing these behaviors, but it's not dangerous in the way that all these other cults people talk about are.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
maybe that might be one of the most difficult things for people to swallow is that because there are so many groups where the leaders turn out to be frauds,
mhm,
it's it's almost like it's jarring when you really look at this guy's life and you're like, holy shit, this is someone who genuinely believed in what he said,
right.
you know?
Yeah, and maybe he didn't too, I don't know, but from all the evidence that I've seen, it seems like he didn't.
Yeah.
I don't ever want to claim that I know what other person believes.
No, I don't either, and I think that's what bothers me a lot is that people are very quick to assume that we can know what was going through someone's mind when they join a group like this. That I think that's why I started doing interviews with people from it was because I realized like, you know, this I don't just want to learn about this group from looking at a two-dimensional image on a screen, especially when there are people out there in the world carrying these ideas around in their head that are open to talking about it.